Picture this: a grand hall in a medieval Gothic court, where towering stone arches echo with whispers of power, and every tapestry tells a story. But one of these woven masterpieces holds a secret. Its threads, carefully stitched in defiance, carry a message so potent it sparked a rebellion that lasted 100 years, all without a single battle cry. This isn't just a piece of fabric, it's a silent revolution, hidden in plain sight. How could something so delicate become a weapon against kings and courts? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. At first glance, the tapestry might seem like nothing more than an ornate decoration, a symbol of wealth and status adorning the cold stone walls. But look closer, and you'll find a coded language of resistance. Every color, every stitch, every hidden symbol was a carefully placed act of rebellion. The artisans who wove it knew the risks speaking out against power could mean ruin or worse. So instead of words, they used their craft to challenge authority, threading dissent into the very fabric of the court's grandeur. This wasn't just art, it was a quiet war fought with needles and thread. What makes this story so extraordinary isn't just the cunning of the weavers or the boldness of their hidden messages. It's the ripple effect that followed, how a single tapestry inspired others, how its symbols spread like wildfire through the courts, igniting a century of silent defiance. This was a rebellion without swords, without bloodshed, but with consequences just as profound. By the time the lords and ladies realized what was happening, it was too late. The threads of resistance were already woven into history. So let's step back into the Gothic era, where art wasn't just beauty, it was power, it was protest, and sometimes it was revolution. The Gothic courts were a world of contradictions, where dazzling wealth masked simmering tensions, and every flicker of candlelight could hide a conspiracy. Think of them as grand chessboards, where kings and bishops made their moves while artisans and scribes watched from the shadows. Power here wasn't just about crowns and decrees. It lived in the unspoken rules, the subtle nods, the way a tapestry hung slightly askew could signal dissent. These courts thrived on control, but control is fragile when creativity slips through the cracks. That's where the weavers came in. Skilled artisans, often overlooked, held a unique power. Their hands shaped the very symbols of authority. A lion woven into a border might represent royal strength, or if stitched with a hidden flaw, it could mock a king's weakness. The courts demanded loyalty, but thread by thread, the weavers stitched a different story. Consider the risk these artisans took. A misplaced symbol, a too obvious metaphor, and they could lose their hands or their lives. Yet they persisted, turning their looms into weapons of quiet defiance. The tapestries they created were more than decorations, they were conversations. A scene of a biblical rebellion might mirror a current lord's tyranny. A hunted stag could symbolize a persecuted noble family. The beauty of it all, the very people who commissioned these works, proud nobles who wanted to display their piety or power, often didn't realize they were funding their own critique. The tapestries hung in plain sight, their messages visible to those who knew how to look. This delicate dance of secrecy and symbolism only worked because the courts themselves were steeped in layers of meaning. Every gesture, every color, even the choice of materials carried weight. Silk from the east might hint at forbidden alliances. A rare dye could signal hidden wealth or heresy. The weavers didn't just exploit this system, they mastered it. And in doing so, they proved something revolutionary, that art, even when commissioned by the powerful, could never truly be controlled. The threads they pulled wove a far greater story, one of resistance that outlasted the courts themselves. The identity of those who created this defiant tapestry remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. Was it the work of a single disillusioned artist or a coordinated effort among a network of rebels? The truth lies somewhere in the shadows of the Gothic courts, where power and peril walked hand in hand. One leading theory suggests it was commissioned by the exiled House of Volta, a noble family stripped of their titles after opposing the king's excessive taxes. Stripped of their voice, they turned to the loom, funding artisans to weave their grievances into something beautiful and subversive. Yet others argue the real masterminds were the weavers themselves. A secret guild known only as the Threadbare Brotherhood had long operated in the margins of court society. These weren't just craftsmen, they were keepers of old traditions, storytellers who passed down techniques laced with double meanings. A particular knot could signify solidarity among oppressed peasants. A rare crimson dye, imported under the guise of luxury, might secretly honor a martyred rebel executed in secret. Every choice was deliberate, every thread a whisper of dissent. What's undeniable is the staggering risk involved. The materials alone could betray them. Certain colors were reserved for royalty, and using them incorrectly was treason. The stitching style, too, held clues. A technique called shadow weave, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, allowed hidden images to emerge only when candlelight hit the fabric at just the right angle. One surviving fragment shows what appears to be a simple hunting scene until the light shifts, revealing a nobleman's face superimposed over a wolf, a damning critique of greed disguised as sport. Perhaps most remarkable of all is how these messages endured. The courts were meticulous in censoring written words, but they underestimated the power of art. A banned pamphlet could be burned, but a tapestry, it was too valuable, too prestigious to destroy. So the rebellion lingered, woven into the very walls of power, waiting centuries for someone to decipher its truth. The artisans knew their audience knew that the very people who sought to silence them would proudly display their defiance as a trophy, and in doing so, they ensured their voices would outlast the kings who tried to erase them. To understand the tapestry's hidden language, you have to think like a weaver in the Gothic courts, where every stitch was a choice, and every choice carried consequences. Take the rose, for instance. At first glance, it might seem like a simple decorative flourish, a nod to beauty or romance. But in this secret visual code, its thorns told another story entirely. Woven with deliberate sharpness, they became a symbol of resistance, a quiet reminder that even the most refined surfaces could draw blood. Then there's the falcon, its wings outstretched but tethered by a golden thread. To the untrained eye, it's just another noble pastime, but to those in the know, it represented the aristocracy itself, regal, powerful, and yet utterly trapped by the very systems they upheld. The real genius, though, lay in the subtler details. The direction of the weaving wasn't just about technique, it was a map. Threads pulled leftward might indicate descent spreading westward across the kingdom, while upward stitches could hint at aspirations, a silent hope rising like smoke from a hidden fire. Even the colors held secrets. A deep blue wasn't merely decorative, it echoed the hues of a rebellious house's heraldry, faded just enough to escape notice but vibrant enough to stir recognition in those who remembered. Scholars piecing together these clues have uncovered scenes within scenes. What appears to be a tranquil garden party is, upon closer inspection, a carefully staged critique. The lord at the center, resplendent in his woven finery, stands atop a pattern of tangled vines, a metaphor for the chaos his policies created. The jesters in the background aren't just entertaining, their exaggerated gestures mirror real courtiers, their folly laid bare in thread. And then there are the borders, often dismissed as mere framing. But in one surviving fragment, the intricate knotwork along the edge spells out a name, an exiled poet whose writings had been banned, immortalized in the one medium the censors couldn't touch. This wasn't just art imitating life, it was art correcting the record. While official chronicles praised the king's wisdom, the tapestries whispered the truth. They turned the court's obsession with spectacle against itself, using its own symbols to expose its flaws. And because these messages were woven, not written, they survived. A book could be burned, a pamphlet torn apart, but unraveling a tapestry, that would mean destroying a treasure, a luxury too costly to waste. So the rebellion endured, stitched into the fabric of history itself, waiting centuries for someone to read between the threads. The journey of the tapestry into the court's inner sanctum was as carefully orchestrated as its symbolism. One account claims it arrived wrapped in layers of deception, a supposed tribute from a border lord, his loyalty bought with promises of land and title. The weavers knew their patron's vanity would outweigh his scrutiny. What noble could resist displaying such a masterpiece, especially one that flattered his lineage? But beneath the golden threads depicting his family crest, the real story lay hidden in the warp and weft, visible only to those who knew where to look. Another version of the tale points to a far riskier delivery. A lady-in-waiting, her robes lined with smuggled silk, carried the folded fabric panel by panel into the throne room over weeks, stitching it together in secret under the cover of night. The guards never questioned her comings and goings after all. Who would suspect a woman's needlework of treason? Yet every time she bent over her embroidery frame, she wasn't just repairing a hem, she was assembling a revolution. Once unveiled, the tapestry became the court's pride. Lords marveled at its craftsmanship, unaware that the artisans had woven their grievances into every scene. A banquet depicted in the central panel seemed to celebrate the king's generosity until you noticed the servants in the background. Their faces, though small, were rendered with startling individuality, their postures tense, their hands clenched around trays of food they'd never tasted. To the nobility, it was mere realism. To the oppressed, it was a manifesto. The moment it was hung marked a turning point. Within days, whispers began curling through the palace corridors like smoke. A stable boy hummed a tune only heard in rebel taverns. A scribe misplaced a tax ledger. These weren't coincidences, they were signals sparked by a shared understanding of the tapestry's hidden language. The ruling class dismissed such acts as minor irritants, but the threads of dissent were already pulling tighter. By the time the first noble noticed a servant smiling at the woven falcon's tether, it was too late. The rebellion had begun not with a shout but with a stitch. The tapestry hung in its place of honor for years, gathering dust but never suspicion. Lords and ladies passed beneath it daily, their eyes skimming over scenes they believed celebrated their glory. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a quiet network of recognition was forming. A steward might pause just a second too long near the woven falcon, fingers brushing against the tether, a signal to the watching scribe. A kitchen maid would hum a tune whose rhythm matched the border's knotwork as she carried trays past guards who never noticed. These weren't accidents, they were conversations happening in plain sight, the tapestry's language spreading through the court like roots beneath a garden. What made this rebellion so extraordinary was its patience. While history loves tales of dramatic uprisings, swords drawn, gates stormed, this resistance moved at the pace of thread through fabric. The organizers knew that haste would unravel everything, so they waited, sometimes for years, as trusted messengers memorized patterns and passed them along not through risky letters, but through embroidery copied onto handkerchiefs, through tavern signs painted with deliberate mistakes in their designs. Even the clergy played their part. A monk might point out a biblical parallel in the tapestry scenes during sermons, turning the court's own piety against it. The real stroke of genius was how the rebels used the nobility's arrogance as their shield. When a duchess commissioned a new cloak inspired by the tapestry's colors, she didn't realize she was wearing the rebels' palette. When a baron demanded his coat of arms include the same rose motif, he became an unwitting billboard for dissent. Every imitation, every homage to the fashionable tapestry only deepened its influence until the symbols were everywhere, too widespread to trace back to their dangerous origins. Yet for all its subtlety, this wasn't a bloodless affair. The court spies were skilled, and occasionally someone would slip. A weaver might vanish mid-project, leaving behind a half-unraveled loom. A page boy who hummed the wrong tune too loudly would be sent to tend vineyards in distant provinces, but each crackdown only strengthened the rebels' resolve. They adapted, developing new layers of codes, a dropped stitch here, an altered shade there, that kept their messages one step ahead of the censors. By the time the court scholars began to suspect the tapestry's true nature, it was far too late. The symbols had already escaped the confines of fabric, appearing in market stalls, in the carvings on choir stalls, even in the patterns of tiles lining the castle courtyards. The rebellion had become a living thing, woven into the daily life of the kingdom itself. And when the first open challenges to the crown finally came, they didn't arrive with the clashing of steel. They came draped in the court's own silks, their banners bearing the very images the nobility had once proudly displayed. The tapestry hadn't just carried a message. It had become the foundation of a new language of resistance, one thread at a time. Art has always been a double-edged sword in the hands of the oppressed, beautiful enough to be celebrated by the powerful, yet sharp enough to cut through their illusions. Long before the Gothic weavers threaded their rebellion, ancient scribes in Mesopotamia pressed cuneiform tablets with hidden complaints against their kings, burying grievances beneath layers of administrative records. Byzantine mosaic artists arranged tiles so saints' eyes seemed to follow corrupt bishops across the chapel floor. Even the great cathedrals of Europe hid stonemasons' jokes in their gargoyles' grotesque faces, mimicking the local nobility, forever frozen in laughter high above the streets. What set the Gothic tapestry apart wasn't just its craftsmanship, but its audacity. While most subversive art of the era hid in shadows carved into dungeon walls or scribbled in the margins of prayer books, this rebellion hung in the throne room itself. Compare it to the samizdat literature of later centuries. Those forbidden texts passed hand to hand in secret. The tapestry did something far more daring. It made the censors complicit in its display. The very people who would burn a seditious broadside would boast about the exquisite artwork in their hall, never realizing they were praising their own critique. Consider the Bayeux Tapestry, that famous 70-meter-long chronicle of the Norman conquest. At first glance, it's a celebration of William the Conqueror's triumph. But look closer, and you'll find the English perspective woven into the borders, small scenes of suffering civilians, of broken oaths, telling a very different story from the main narrative. This duality became a blueprint for dissent. Centuries later, during the Protestant Reformation, Huguenot weavers in France would create tapestries depicting biblical Daniel surviving the lion's den, a not-so-subtle metaphor for their own survival under Catholic persecution. The lions wore bishops' mitres if you knew how to look, yet none of these examples had the staying power of our Gothic masterpiece. A rebellious song could be outlawed, its singer exiled. A critical play might see its theatre shuttered, but unraveling a tapestry, that would be like burning money. These were investments, status symbols, often worth more than the castles they adorned. So while authorities destroyed countless dangerous books and paintings across the medieval world, the tapestries endured, their messages preserved not despite their value, but because of it. The rebellion didn't just survive, it thrived in gilded frames, whispered between servants who recognized the hidden stag in the hunting scene, passed down through generations of weavers who added their own layers of meaning with each repair. Perhaps the most striking parallel comes from halfway across the world. In 15th century Joseon Korea, court painters developed a technique called kikjori, still life scrolls of books and scholarly objects that at first glance celebrated Confucian learning. But to the persecuted Catholic minority, certain arrangements of brushes and inkstones formed secret crosses, while the folds of painted drapes concealed Madonna-like silhouettes. Like the Gothic weavers, these artists turned the regime's own symbols against it, hiding heresy in plain sight. The difference, where the Korean scrolls were eventually hunted down by suspicious officials, the European tapestry's grandeur protected it. No inquisitor would dare accuse a duke of treason over something hanging in his own hall. This longevity gave the tapestry something rare in the history of dissent: the ability to evolve. Later restorers, recognizing the original weaver's intent, would subtly reinforce certain symbols while allowing others to fade. A rose's thorns might be reinforced with gold thread during repairs, while a compromising noble's face could be accidentally obscured by new foliage. The rebellion adapted across generations, its message shifting with the times yet always retaining its core defiance. Unlike a static pamphlet or painting, the tapestry lived, and with each passing decade, its threads wove deeper into the fabric of history itself. The first signs came subtly: a visiting countess admiring the tapestry's craftsmanship, then commissioning her own version with a few minor adjustments. Her weavers, some whispered, had shared a drink with artisans from the original workshop. The new piece arrived months later, its central scene nearly identical, but the border told a different story. Where the first tapestry had vines, this one featured chains, their links cleverly disguised as decorative flourishes. The countess hung it in her solar, never noticing how her own steward's eyes lingered on those chains each morning when he drew the curtains. Word spread through channels the nobility couldn't trace. A merchant transporting silks might carry a sampler folded between bolts of fabric, its stitches demonstrating a new code. A troubadour's ballad about a woven rose contained precise instructions for replicating the thorn's rebellious angle. By the time a third tapestry appeared in a neighboring duchy, this one with a falcon's tether fraying just slightly, the pattern was clear. This wasn't imitation, it was evolution. Each new piece adapted the original's language to local struggles. A coastal lord's version hid fishing nets among its motifs, a nod to unfair tariffs on the catch. A mountain barony's rendition threaded silver wire through jagged peaks, echoing miners' demands for better wages. The brilliance lay in how openly these works circulated. Nobles traded them as gifts, boasting of their exquisite taste, unaware they were passing along blueprints for descent. A single tapestry's influence now stretched across hundreds of miles, its symbols mutating to fit new context yet retaining their core defiance. Artisans developed a system of shared motifs. A knotted rope might signify solidarity in one region, resistance to bondage in another, but the underlying message of unity remained. Meanwhile, the courts marveled at this sudden renaissance of weaving. Oblivious to the irony, they hosted exhibitions, inviting rivals to admire collections that unwittingly displayed their own vulnerabilities. A duke might point proudly to a scene of peasants harvesting wheat, missing how the figure's postures mirrored protesters outside his own granaries. The very act of displaying these works became a kind of confession, their hidden truths hanging in plain sight. What began as one artist's quiet protest had become a chorus. The original tapestry's greatest rebellion wasn't in its stitches. It was proving that once an idea takes root in art, it can't be contained. Like dandelion seeds on the wind, each thread carried the potential for new defiance, sprouting where least expected. And the more the nobility admired their walls, the less they noticed the whispers between servants who recognized the patterns, the nods between guards who spotted familiar symbols. The rebellion no longer lived in a single piece of fabric. It lived in the way people looked at it and through it at the world they meant to change. History often forgets the quiet architects of rebellion, but in the case of the Gothic tapestry, women weren't just participants. They were the rebellion's secret heartbeat. Take Lady Eleanora of Volta, the exiled countess who reportedly smuggled the first designs out of her confiscated estate, hiding them in the lining of her prayer book. Or the unnamed guild mistress who trained a generation of weavers in the shadow weave technique, turning her workshop into a school for silent dissent. These women understood something the court overlooked. In a world where their words could be dismissed as gossip or heresy, thread became their voice. The noblewomen who commissioned these works played a dangerous double game. Publicly, they were patrons of the arts, cultivating refinement. Privately, they dictated scenes loaded with meaning, a huntress aiming her bow just left of center, subtly challenging the king's claim to divine marksmanship. A duchess might insist her tapestry include a particular shade of green, knowing it matched the livery of a banned merchant guild. Their power lay in plausible deniability. After all, who would accuse a high-born lady of understanding textile symbolism? Yet their choices shaped the rebellion's visual language, embedding critiques in every decorative flourish. Then there were the weavers themselves, often women from artisan families who'd mastered their craft over lifetimes. Their needles were as precise as any scribe's quill, but where a scribe might face execution for treasonous words, a weaver could claim artistic license. A misplaced stitch, merely fatigue, an odd color choice, a dye lot inconsistency. Their workbenches became sanctuaries of subversion, where patterns passed down through generations carried hidden meanings. A grandmother's knot technique might signal solidarity, while a particular way of blending threads could indicate safe houses for fugitives. Perhaps most crucially, women dominated the networks that spread the tapestry's influence. Servants folding laundry would recognize rebellious motifs in their lady's new shawl and replicate them in household linens. Midwives carried coded messages in embroidered birth blankets, their stitches mapping escape routes for dissidents. Even children's dolls became tools, their tiny garments stitched with symbols that, when arranged just so, revealed meeting times. This was rebellion woven into the fabric of daily life, its architects hidden behind the very stereotypes meant to silence them. The chatty seamstress, the frivolous noblewoman, the superstitious old nurse. The court's blind spot became the rebel's greatest weapon. When a baron's wife, idly, suggested her husband display a particular tapestry in his council chamber, no one questioned her. When a weaver's daughter accidentally sent a flawed sample to the bishop's residence, its border containing a near-perfect map of the dungeon tunnels, it was dismissed as a novice's error. Female involvement lent the rebellion its endurance. Where male-led plots often flared and burned, this resistance smoldered for generations, its keepers passing needles like torches in the dark. By the time historians pieced together their roles centuries later, the evidence was everywhere, in household records showing noblewomen purchasing suspicious quantities of rare dyes, in guild ledgers listing unusually large payments to embroiderers of special projects, even in the faint pencil marks on the backs of surviving tapestries where patterns had been traced and retraced by countless hands. These women didn't just contribute to the rebellion, they sustained it, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't shouting from the rampart, it's knowing exactly which thread to pull. Nothing protected the rebellion's messages quite like the halo of holiness. By stitching biblical scenes into their designs, the weavers gave their tapestries an armor of piety. Who would dare question a depiction of Saint Michael slaying the dragon, even if the dragon's scales suspiciously resembled the king's crown? The Church, ever vigilant against heresy, became an unwitting guardian of the very dissent it sought to suppress. Bishops proudly displayed these works in their cathedrals, oblivious to the fact that every saint's martyrdom in the woven scenes mirrored the fate of local dissenters. Consider the Last Supper panel woven for a powerful cardinal's dining hall. At first glance, it was a solemn tribute to Christ's final meal. But those who knew the code noticed Judas's face bore a striking resemblance to the cardinal's own tax collector, his robes edged with the same pattern as the hated grain sacks peasants were forced to fill. The disciples' hands, supposedly reaching for bread, were positioned to form the sign of a banned peasant alliance. Yet because the scene was sacred, no one dared scrutinize it too closely. To do so would risk accusations of impiety. The rebels had turned the Church's own reverence against it. Even more audacious were the Marian tapestries, where the Virgin's blue cloak became a canvas for subversion. In one notorious example, the folds of her mantle concealed the outlines of a forbidden map, the route to sanctuary for those fleeing the king's justice. Pilgrims kneeling before the image would whisper prayers while memorizing the hidden paths. The weavers exploited a brilliant loophole. Destroying such a holy image would be sacrilege, so the Church preserved the rebellion even as it hunted the rebels. Sympathetic clergy played a delicate game. A monastery's abbot might commission a tapestry showing the flight into Egypt, then, accidentally, hang it near a window where sunlight revealed hidden threads depicting not Herod's soldiers, but the current regime's enforcers. If confronted, he could claim artistic interpretation. After all, wasn't oppression timeless? The tapestries became theological riddles, their dual meanings allowing plausible deniability. A bishop preaching on the woven parable of the Good Samaritan might emphasize how the robbed traveler's tunic matched the garb of persecuted merchants, all while maintaining he was simply explicating scripture. This holy camouflage reached its peak with the Apocalypse Cycle, a series commissioned by a particularly zealous archbishop. The weavers filled it with timely symbolism, the 4 horsemen's plagues suspiciously matching the effects of the crown's new taxes, the whore of Babylon wearing a headdress resembling the queen's favorite tiara. When the archbishop toured his diocese with the tapestries as teaching tools, peasants saw not Revelation's horrors, but their own suffering validated. The Church had given dissent its loudest megaphone, all while believing it was sounding the trumpet of salvation. The ultimate irony, many of these works were later venerated as miracle-working. A tapestry where the Holy Family's flight mirrored a contemporary refugee route became a site of pilgrimage, its miraculous details inspiring devotion. The very threads meant to critique power now drew the faithful, proof that once art escapes its creator's hands, it takes on meanings even they couldn't foresee. The rebellion didn't just hide behind sacred imagery, it became sacred, wrapping its critique in a shroud of devotion no censor would dare tear away. The moment of realization struck like a thunderclap in the quietest hour of the night. After decades of hanging unquestioned, the tapestry's secrets unraveled before the eyes of a royal advisor, perhaps a man who'd once studied heraldry or a disgruntled artisan seeking favor. What tipped the scales? Maybe it was the way a visiting diplomat paused too long before the woven falcon, his knowing glance caught by a paranoid chamberlain. Or perhaps it was a drunken noble slurring praise for the tapestries, clever little jokes at a banquet, unaware he just exposed the court's open secret. However it happened, the revelation sent shockwaves through the halls of power. Overnight, the very symbols of prestige became threats. Servants arrived at dawn to find lords and bishops running their hands along the tapestry's edges, searching for hidden stitches like surgeons probing a wound. Panic bred absurdity. A duchess ordered her entire collection burned, only to be halted by her steward's frantic calculations of the cost. A monastery hastily turned their prized Last Supper panel to face the wall, claiming it needed repairs. But the real terror lay in the dawning understanding. This wasn't confined to one tapestry. The rebellion had metastasized. The same motifs appeared in altar cloths, in merchant banners, even in the embroidery of a princess's wedding gown. The court's obsession with displaying wealth had allowed dissent to weave itself into the visual language of the realm. Their attempts at censorship only amplified the chaos. When guards began tearing down tapestries in the capital square, the crowd's murmurs turned to shouts not of protest but of outrage at the waste. These were treasures, heirlooms, investments. A bishop who ordered a suspect piece cut apart found himself facing rebellion from his own clergy, who saw sacrilege in destroying sacred art. The harder the elite tried to erase the symbols, the more they cemented their significance. A merchant, watching his guild's banner confiscated, simply painted the same design on his shop sign the next day. A weaver arrested for seditious stitching became a folk hero, her portrait circulated on, of all things, embroidered handkerchiefs. What the courts failed to grasp was that the rebellion had long since escaped the confines of fabric. The symbols had taken root in the culture itself. Bakers shaped loaves with telltale knots in the crust. Children's games incorporated the falcon and tether motif. Even the coins in people's pockets bore designs that, when arranged just so, echoed the tapestry's most damning scenes. The elite could burn cloth, but they couldn't unsee what their subjects had learned: that power, no matter how gilded, could be unraveled one thread at a time. In their desperation, some nobles tried to co-opt the movement, commissioning new tapestries that clumsily mimicked the rebel aesthetic. But the people weren't fooled. They'd grown fluent in this visual language, and now they could spot counterfeit dissent as easily as a forged signature. The original weavers had planted something far more dangerous than rebellion. They'd planted literacy. A population that could read symbols couldn't be fooled by spectacle anymore. So when the king finally ordered a grand new tapestry for his throne room, a blatant propaganda piece showing him as a benevolent shepherd, the silence in the hall wasn't reverence. It was the sound of 100 people biting their tongues, their eyes tracing the deliberately frayed edge of the shepherd's crook, understanding the message the weavers had risked their lives to stitch. Even kings can be cut down to size. The crackdown came swift and brutal, a tempest of royal decrees and ecclesiastical tribunals. Overnight, the weavers' guilds found themselves under siege, their workshops raided not for contraband or weapons, but for patterns, those innocent-looking sketches now deemed as dangerous as drawn swords. Interrogators pored over ledgers, searching for discrepancies in dye purchases that might hint at rebellious colors. A particularly zealous inquisitor developed an obsession with thread counts, convinced the number of stitches per inch contained coded messages. The absurdity masked genuine terror among the elite. They weren't just hunting artists, but the very idea that art could slip through their fingers. Yet for all their efforts, the authorities faced an impossible task. Burn one tapestry, and 3 more would surface in its place, smuggled out by servants who'd spent years dusting the originals. A nobleman in the western provinces made the fatal mistake of publicly burning a suspect piece in his courtyard, only to find the next morning that his stable walls had been mysteriously painted with the same design in charcoal and berry juice. The rebellion had escaped the Loom, taking root in mediums far harder to control. Street vendors sold honey cakes stamped with the forbidden rose motif. Midwives tied birthing charms with knots that mirrored the tapestry's borders. Even the weather vanes on church steeples began suspiciously pointing in directions that traced out the rebel's sigil when viewed from above. What truly unnerved the crown, though, was the way the symbols mutated under pressure. A weaver arrested in the capital might reveal one code under torture only for his apprentices to scatter, each adapting the symbols to their own struggles. In mining towns, the falcon became a pickaxe. Along the coast, the tangled vines transformed into fishing nets. The authorities expected a central conspiracy to crush. Instead, they found 100 localized rebellions speaking the same visual language. A bishop's report from this period survives, its frustration palpable. We tear their banners, yet their heresy seeps into the very cobblestones. The most ingenious resistance came from unexpected quarters. A group of monks, ostensibly copying illuminated manuscripts, began subtly altering the borders of sacred texts to include the rebellious motifs. When challenged, they claimed divine inspiration after all. Who could argue with God's aesthetic choices? A traveling puppeteer staged shows where the villain's costume suspiciously resembled the Grand Inquisitor's robes, the children in the audience shrieking with glee when the hero accidentally set them on fire. Even the crown's own propaganda backfired. A commissioned mural meant to glorify the king's lineage was quietly subverted by the painters, who gave every royal ancestor the same faintly crossed eyes, a visual joke that became shorthand for incompetence. By the time the authorities realized their mistake, the damage was irreversible. In trying to erase the tapestry, they'd turned it into a living thing, no longer confined to fabric, but woven into the culture itself. The symbols had become a language everyone spoke, but no one could fully control. A merchant fined for displaying a suspect sign would simply carve it into his countertop the next day. A poet banned from writing verses about roses composed a nursery rhyme about gardens that every child in the kingdom could recite. The harder the crown pressed, the clearer the truth became. You can burn a tapestry, but you can't burn what it represents. The rebellion had become immortal, not despite the crackdown, but because of it. Every act of suppression was another stitch in the story. The moment the tapestry's hidden language became common knowledge, the rebellion didn't collapse, it transformed. Symbols that had once been whispered about in shadowy corners now blazed openly on banners hung in market squares. The falcon, once a subtle critique of aristocratic control, soared defiantly on flags carried by protesters. The rose's thorns, painstakingly stitched into fabric for generations, now adorned the lapels of merchants who refused to pay the crown's extortionate tariffs. What had begun as a silent protest woven into art became a chorus of action, each act of defiance amplifying the next. Petitions appeared overnight, their margins decorated with familiar motifs, a nod to the tapestry's legacy. These weren't the groveling pleas of subjects begging for mercy, but bold declarations of rights, their language sharpened by years of coded practice. Signatures sprawled beneath them in ink, but also in thread. Embroidered samplers arrived at the castle gates, their stitches forming the names of those too afraid to put pen to paper but brave enough to pick up a needle. The court scribes scoffed at first, until they realized the samplers couldn't be burned like parchment without igniting a public outcry over the destruction of women's work. Then came the boycotts. Goods from loyalist merchants rotted in warehouses as buyers deliberately sought out markets flying the rebel rose. A single glance at a merchant's stall, was that border on his awning the old knot pattern, could make or break his trade. The economy itself became a battleground, with weavers leading the charge. When the king imposed a tax on imported dyes, the guilds collectively forgot how to produce the deep purples and scarlets favored by the nobility. Suddenly, court robes faded to dull hues, while rebel sympathizers flaunted vibrant cloaks dyed with smuggled pigments. But the most ingenious shift was in the sabotage, small, precise, and utterly demoralizing. Palace stewards found banquet tablecloths, accidentally stitched with scenes of biblical plagues facing the king's seat. Wine barrels bore subtle carvings of the falcons' tether snapping, their contents mysteriously souring by the time they reached the royal cellars. Even the castle's clocks seemed to join the rebellion, their gears slipping at odd hours to chime in unison with protest songs from the streets below. Each act was deniable, but collectively they sent an unmistakable message. The people had learned to wield their discontent as skillfully as the weavers had wielded their needles. The irony was exquisite. The same nobles who'd once admired the tapestry's craftsmanship now found themselves unraveling at the edges, their authority frayed by 1,000 tiny cuts. They dismissed fabric as harmless decoration until it became the blueprint for their undoing. And as the first stones flew at tax collectors' windows, painted with the rebel rose, the truth became inescapable. This was no longer a war of symbols, but a reckoning. The loom had taught the people patience, but now the threads they pulled were real. The masterminds behind the rebellion were as carefully woven into history as the threads they manipulated, some names etched in court records or guild ledgers, others lost to time like frayed edges of an ancient cloth. Take Duke Alaric of Volta, the disgraced noble whose exile supposedly birthed the first designs. Official histories paint him as a failed conspirator, but his real legacy wasn't in swords or schemes, it was in the patronage of artisans. Before his arrest, he'd quietly funded a scriptorium where illuminators practiced a peculiar skill, hiding secular maps inside illuminated letters. When his lands were confiscated, the scribes dispersed, their techniques seeping into weaving workshops under new disguises. Then there was Brother Anselm, the radical monk whose sermons compared biblical tyrants to contemporary rulers a little too explicitly. Banished to a remote abbey, he supposedly taught weavers how to encode scripture into patterns, a parable's moral stitched into a vine's curve, a prophet's warning hidden in a garment's fold. His greatest innovation, using the church's own color symbolism against it, a tapestry of the martyr St. Lawrence, commissioned for a bishop's hall, showed the saint's grill not with flames but with threads of gold, a sly critique of the clergy's greed. But the true architects were people whose names rarely graced parchment. Guild Master Elspeth, recorded only in a single tax dispute, allegedly trained her weavers to leave deliberate flaws, a dropped stitch forming a rebel's initial, a border's not count matching the date of a hated edict. Her most audacious act, convincing noble clients that irregularities were marks of artistic spontaneity, turning mistakes into a covert language. Then there were the unnamed, the dyers who mixed forbidden pigments into royal commissions, turning the king's purple cloak slightly gray, the laundresses who pressed folds into tapestries to highlight hidden scenes, even the court jester who, according to a scribbled marginalia, jested in thread, wearing motley that mirrored rebel patterns when the light struck just so. Their anonymity wasn't an accident, it was strategy. Unlike kings or bishops, these figures built legacies meant to dissolve into the collective. A weaver arrested in one town might confess to being the sole mastermind, drawing attention from a dozen others still working. Guild records were kept deliberately vague, with apprentices listed as the dark-haired girl or the limping boy. Even the materials conspired in their secrecy. Wool and silk carried no signatures, only the whispers of technique passed from hand to hand. What bound them together wasn't just rebellion, but a shared understanding of power's blindness. The nobility tracked bloodlines and land deeds, never suspecting that a servant's embroidery hoop could be as dangerous as a smuggled sword. The movement thrived because it lived where authority least expected it, in beauty, in devotion, in the daily labor deemed too humble to matter. By the time the courts realized their error, the tapestry's makers had already ensured their greatest victory. They'd made their message inseparable from the culture itself. To destroy it now would require unraveling the world. Centuries after the Gothic weavers threaded their quiet revolution, their legacy pulsed through the veins of Europe's greatest uprisings. The French Revolution's pamphleteers may have wielded printing presses, but their most potent weapons were caricatures, grotesque cartoons of Marie Antoinette that echoed the tapestry's hidden mockery. A nobleman's face stitched into a wolf's body became a baker's crude sketch of the queen as a harpy, her talons clutching golden bread. The medium had changed, but the strategy remained. Turn the powerful into their own caricatures and let the people's laughter do the rest. Even the American Revolution borrowed from the playbook, colonial women spinning bees where they wove homespun cloth to boycott British textiles weren't just economic protests, they were performances. Every turn of the spindle echoed the Gothic weaver's defiance, transforming domestic crafts into acts of rebellion. And when Paul Revere needed to spread word of British movements, he didn't just ride, he commissioned engraved prints of the Boston Massacre, their exaggerated bloodstains serving the same purpose as the tapestry's coded thorns, shock wrapped in artistry. But nowhere was the legacy more striking than in 19th century Poland. Under Russian occupation, patriots smuggled nationalist messages into embroidered folk costumes. A flower's petal count might signify rally dates. The arrangement of colors could map secret meeting points. When Tsarist officials banned traditional dress, the rebellion simply migrated to handkerchiefs and table linens, ordinary objects too ubiquitous to confiscate. Like the Gothic artisans, these embroiderers weaponized the mundane, proving that oppression often overlooks what it considers women's work. The real testament to the tapestry's influence, though, lies in its paradox. The most effective revolutions aren't always the loudest sometimes. They're the ones that seep into the culture until they're indistinguishable from daily life. The suffragettes knew this when they stitched their banners with purple, white, and green, turning fashion into a manifesto. The Danish resistance understood it during World War II, weaving intelligence reports into knitting patterns. Even today, Belarusian protesters coordinate via quilt patterns shared on messaging apps, their grandmothers' stitches becoming digital resistance. What the Gothic weavers gifted these movements wasn't just a tactic, but a philosophy that the tools of control can always be repurposed. A king's tapestry becomes his indictment. A censored press births underground cartoons. A banned flag reappears in a child's doodle. Because the quietest rebellions aren't just heard, they're remembered, repeated, and reborn in forms the powerful never see coming. And that's why, long after the original threads frayed, their pattern still guides the hands of those who weave change. Today, fragments of the rebellious tapestry hang in museums under careful lighting, their threads whispering across centuries to anyone who cares to listen. Scholars peer through magnifying glasses, debating whether a particular vine's twist was meant to symbolize a biblical parable or a tax collector's noose. The ambiguity is deliberate, what one historian calls political subversion, another interprets as spiritual allegory. A curator in Vienna insists the falcon's tether represents the soul bound by sin, while her counterpart in Paris argues it's a literal critique of feudal land laws. The truth, as always, lies in the eye of the beholder, and perhaps that was the weaver's greatest trick of all, crafting a message elastic enough to stretch across time, adapting to whatever struggle needed its voice. Modern artists have taken up the tapestry's mantle with striking creativity. In London, a textile collective stitches corporate logos into traditional medieval patterns, their work hanging in bank lobbies where sharp-eyed employees note how the golden threads form protest slogans when sunlight hits just right. A street artist in Barcelona pastes up murals that mimic the tapestry's border motifs until you step back and realize the decorative knots outline maps of eviction protests. Even digital spaces have become looms for dissent. A viral algorithm transforms selfies into rebel portraits, overlaying faces with the original tapestry's thorned roses. The tools have changed, but the strategy remains eerily familiar. Wrap your critique in something too beautiful to ignore, too valuable to destroy. Yet the tapestry's legacy isn't just about rebellion, it's about the way art refuses to be neutral. A fragment displayed in a Tokyo museum becomes a flashpoint when activists project modern wage data onto its scenes of medieval labor. Schoolchildren in Mexico City weave their own versions with threads dyed from local plants, embedding stories of water rights into the patterns. The original weavers would recognize this instinct instantly. Creativity isn't a decoration for power, but a mirror held up to its flaws. Perhaps that's why the fragments still unsettle us. In an age of hashtags and holograms, these frayed textiles remind us that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quiet, persistent, threaded through the fabric of everyday life. A museum visitor might walk away haunted by a single detail, how the light catches a nearly invisible stitch, revealing a face in the crowd that looks, just for a moment, like their own. The tapestry's legacy is so potent that it spawned whispers of the supernatural, claims that its threads held more than symbolism, that they pulsed with actual magic. Some insist the weavers weren't just artisans but alchemists, blending rare dyes with enchanted pigments that could sway minds or curse those who mocked its patterns. A particularly persistent myth suggests the falcon's golden tether wasn't merely thread but spun from a metal that hummed when touched, a frequency only certain ears could detect. These stories, though debunked by historians, reveal something fascinating. When facts blur into legend, even the most rational minds itch to add their own stitches to the mystery. Then there's the theory that this masterpiece was merely a decoy, that its true purpose was to distract from something far more dangerous hidden elsewhere. Conspiracy hunters point to a cryptic entry in a 15th century merchant's diary, describing a veiled sister to the tapestry, twice as large and 10 times as damning. They speculate it was smuggled into a rival kingdom or buried beneath a monastery, its location encoded in the original's border knots. Never mind that no such textile has ever surfaced. The allure of a lost, even more explosive truth keeps the myth alive. What fuels these speculations isn't just the human love of a good story, it's the tapestry's uncanny ability to defy simple explanation. Unlike a signed treaty or a king's decree, its meaning shifts with every viewer. A noblewoman might see a pious biblical scene, while a disgruntled mason recognizes the hidden hammers in the stonework. This fluidity makes it the perfect canvas for projection. The same ambiguity that once protected the weavers now invites wild theories, from secret societies to divine interventions. The most poignant theory, though, isn't about magic or hidden masterpieces. It's the idea that the tapestry was always meant to be misunderstood. That its creators wove deliberate contradictions into its fabric, knowing future generations would debate its true meaning. In this light, the conspiracy theories aren't distractions, they're proof the rebellion still works. Every time someone pores over the threads searching for occult symbols or lost maps, they're participating in the same game of secrecy and revelation that fooled the courts centuries ago. The real enchantment isn't in the tapestry, it's in how effortlessly it turns us all into detectives, forever tugging at its threads. To weave rebellion into something as scrutinized as a court tapestry required more than courage, it demanded near superhuman craftsmanship. Picture a weaver bent over her loom, fingers flying not just to create beauty, but to bury secrets in plain sight. The techniques they perfected would make modern cryptographers marvel. Double-sided stitching allowed a scene to shift meaning depending on the viewer's angle. A hunting party by daylight might reveal fleeing dissenters when candlelight hit the threads at dusk. Reversible patterns turned borders into puzzles. Flip a corner and a decorative vine became a chain of shackles. Even the thread counts held significance, with precise numbers of stitches per inch corresponding to dates or coded references to banned texts. The materials themselves were part of the cipher. Certain dyes, like the rare Tyrian purple reserved for royalty, could be subtly adulterated. A hue slightly off might mock a king's legitimacy. Silk threads imported from Venice carried whispers of foreign alliances, while locally spun wool embedded regional grievances. The weavers exploited every technical limitation. The slight warp of linen under tension could distort a noble's profile just enough to suggest corruption, while gold-wrapped threads, meant to glorify, might be knotted to form a mocking smirk when sunlight struck. What's astonishing isn't just the complexity, but the consistency. Across workshops and generations, these artisans maintained a shared visual language. A guild in the north might use a particular knot to signify solidarity, while southern weavers echoed it with a mirrored technique, all without written instructions. Their training was oral, their patterns memorized, their innovations passed along through seemingly innocent samplers. A master might correct an apprentice's stitch with a tug that actually taught a new code. The greatest risk lay in the margins of error. Too obvious and the tapestry became evidence, too subtle and the message died unheard. Surviving fragments show deliberate flaws, a saint's halo missing a single stitch to imply false piety, or a hunting dog's leash frayed where the thread tension slackened. These weren't mistakes but calibrated provocations. The weavers knew their audience, nobles who dismiss a dropped stitch as carelessness, while those in the know would recognize it as a rallying cry. Modern imaging technology has revealed even deeper layers. X-rays of one panel show threads deliberately woven backward in sections, creating nearly invisible textures detectable only by touch, a tactile code for the blind scribe who catalogued the castle's treasures. Another, when backlit, reveals watermarks of quill pens alongside swords, a silent nod to the power of words over weapons. This wasn't just embroidery, it was an entire information network rendered in silk and wool. The ultimate testament to their skill, many tapestries survived precisely because their craftsmanship was too exquisite to destroy. Even kings who later grasped their subversion couldn't bring themselves to burn such valuable art. Instead, they locked them away unaware that in the darkness the threads preserved their secrets, waiting centuries for someone to read them anew. The original tapestry, that incendiary masterpiece of threaded rebellion, exists today only in fragments scattered like pieces of a puzzle no one may ever fully assemble. Some claim it met its end in the flames of the royal purge, reduced to ashes by the same hands that once admired its artistry. Others swear it was smuggled away in the dead of night, rolled tight and hidden in a wine merchant's cart, or buried beneath the flagstones of a sympathetic monastery. The truth, it's likely both. Historians now believe the tapestry wasn't a single piece, but a series of panels, some destroyed, some dispersed, their messages fragmented but never fully erased. A handful of surviving sections tell a haunting story. One fragment, displayed behind bulletproof glass in a Brussels museum, shows a nobleman's feast interrupted by a peculiar detail. The wine in his goblet isn't red, but a murky green, a color contemporaries would have recognized as the shade of tarnished copper, a sly nod to the corruption poisoning the court. Another scrap, owned by a reclusive collector in Prague, preserves a border of intertwined thorns and roses. At first glance, it's decorative, but under ultraviolet light, faint stitches emerge, numbers, perhaps a date or a code, now too faded to decipher. The most tantalizing clue lies in a Parisian archive where a crumbling inventory from 1582 lists one hanging of Gideon's fleece, much worn to be repaired. Scholars suspect this was the tapestry's disguised name, a biblical reference masking its subversion. The entry ends with a single cryptic note, given into the keeping of the Lady of the North Tower. No such tower exists in surviving records, fueling theories that the piece was secreted away to a remote estate, or even across the sea. Yet the absence of the original may be its final act of defiance. Unlike a painting or sculpture, a tapestry's power lies in its reproducibility. Every copied stitch, every borrowed motif kept the rebellion alive long after the first threads frayed. Those fragments that survive aren't just artifacts, they're invitations. To run a finger along the glass protecting that Brussels fragment is to trace the same ridges a weaver's needle once pressed into the wool, to feel the ghost of a tension they deliberately left unresolved. The full picture may be lost, but its absence whispers a question. What might still be waiting in some forgotten chest, some dusty attic, ready to unravel history all over again? Long after the last threads frayed, the tapestry's story refused to be confined to fabric. It wove itself into the very soul of the culture, becoming the stuff of fireside tales and tavern songs. A traveling minstrel might strum a ballad about the loom of shadows, his verses painting the weavers as spectral figures who stitched by moonlight, their needles drawing blood from those who betrayed their cause. Children skipped rope to rhymes about the falcon who snapped its tether, the cadence of their game echoing the rebellion's heartbeat. Even the clergy, once unwitting accomplices, found their sermons borrowing its imagery. A priest might warn his flock of thorns hidden among roses, his metaphor carrying layers his congregation understood all too well. The tapestry's leap from artifact to legend was no accident. Oppressed communities, denied their own histories in official records, clung to its symbolism like a lifeline. In one mining village, workers carved the rebel rose into the handles of their picks, turning tools of labor into declarations of solidarity. A band playwright penned a comedy where a foolish baron hung a tapestry upside down, oblivious as his servants stifled laughter at the inverted symbols mocking him. The joke spread like wildfire, its punchline a shared wink among those who recognized the reference. The story had become something far more dangerous than cloth. It was now a language everyone spoke but no authority could confiscate. Writers and poets were particularly enchanted. A forgotten sonnet from the 16th century describes a lady unraveling a tapestry at dusk, discovering names of the vanished stitched into its reverse side, a haunting metaphor for historical erasure. Centuries later, romantic poets would fixate on the weavers, silent sublime, comparing their craft to Prometheus stealing fire. The Victorians, ever obsessed with moral allegories, reimagined the tapestry as a cautionary fable about pride, their illustrated editions showing kings struck blind by their own embroidered reflections. Each retelling bent the legend to new purposes, proving its adaptability. Folklore amplified the mystique. A persistent legend claimed that any ruler who tried to burn the tapestry would find the flames turning the colors brighter, the threads singing as they burned. Another tale spoke of a ghostly weaver who appeared in workshops before uprisings, her spectral loom clacking in empty rooms, the most enduring myth. That the original tapestry was never destroyed, it simply unraveled itself one night. its threads slithering away to weave new rebellions elsewhere. These stories, however fanciful, served a very real purpose. They kept the spirit of resistance alive long after the physical object had faded. What's remarkable is how the tapestry's legacy bifurcated. To the powerless, it symbolized the inevitability of justice, a reminder that even the mightiest could be undone by patience and cleverness. But for those in power, it became a parable about vigilance. A 17th-century duke famously hung a replica in his hall, not for its beauty, but as a daily reminder to his heirs: art sleeps until it awakens. The duality was perfect. The same story could inspire a peasant's hope or a noble's paranoia, depending on who was listening. Modern adaptations continue this tradition. A popular fantasy novelist borrowed the motif of threaded rebellion for her best-selling series, where embroidered maps lead revolutionaries through enchanted cities. A hit television drama featured a subplot about activists smuggling messages in knockoff designer handbags, their patterns paying homage to the tapestry's coded borders. Even video games have gotten in on the act, with one acclaimed role-playing game allowing players to solve puzzles by aligning virtual threads to reveal hidden rebel bases. The medium changes, but the core truth remains. There's something irresistible about the idea that beauty can be a battleground. The tapestry's greatest triumph wasn't surviving intact. It was fragmenting so completely that its pieces lodged in countless imaginations. Like seeds carried by the wind, those fragments took root wherever they landed, blooming into new stories tailored to their time. A protest slogan today might quote a punk song from the 80s, unaware that song borrowed its metaphor from a folk tune that once echoed the tapestry's themes. The rebellion never ended, it just learned to speak in 1,000 voices. Archaeologists brush dirt from a scrap of fabric no larger than a palm print, their fingers tracing threads that haven't seen daylight in 500 years. This fragment, unearthed from the ruins of a Gothic court storeroom, might seem insignificant until you notice the peculiar knotwork along its edge, an exact match to descriptions of the infamous tapestry's rebellious borders. Across Europe, similar discoveries are rewriting history. A clump of indigo dyed wool preserved in a sealed cellar, a ledger detailing payments for rose crimson thread special order, even a broken loom weight etched with symbols resembling the falcon motif. Each artifact is a whisper from the past, daring us to listen. The most compelling find emerged from beneath a monastery in northern France, a sealed chest containing swatches of fabric tagged with cryptic notations. One bears a stitched number sequence that aligns with tax records from the rebellion's peak years. Another shows a hunting scene interrupted by what conservators initially assumed was damage, until infrared imaging revealed deliberate cuts forming the shape of a crown with a cracked rim. These weren't accidents, they were breadcrumbs left by weavers who knew their work might outlast them. Dye analysis has proven particularly revealing. Using mass spectrometry, researchers identified traces of a rare yellow pigment imported from Persia, a color reserved for royalty, yet found stitched into the borders of what should have been a peasant's tunic in one fragment. This wasn't a mistake, it was mockery. Even more telling are the mended sections where repairs overlay hidden messages. X-rays of a supposedly innocuous floral panel show older stitches beneath. A distorted face, perhaps a deposed noble, carefully concealed beneath later embroidery. The tapestry didn't just carry secrets, it buried them in layers like a palimpsest of descent. Yet every discovery deepens the mystery as much as it solves it. A pattern book recovered from a well in Burgundy contains designs nearly identical to the rebel motifs, but with marginal notes in a cipher no one's cracked. Were these instructions for future weavers or a map to something larger? The debate rages between scholars who see the tapestry as a singular masterpiece and those who believe it was merely the most famous piece in a sprawling network of subversive art. One radical theory suggests the surviving fragments aren't from the original at all, but from countless copies, a distributed rebellion where every workshop added its own symbols, making suppression impossible. The most haunting clue came from an unexpected place: the dental records of the era. Skeletal remains near weaving centers show an unusual prevalence of stained teeth, not from decay, but from holding needles between lips stained by dye. These artisans didn't just risk their livelihoods, they ingested their rebellion quite literally. It's a visceral reminder that history isn't just written in ink or thread, but in the bodies of those who shaped it. As archaeologists sift through soil and scholars debate lab results, one truth becomes clear: the tapestry's full message may still be waiting, not in a single grand revelation, but in the cumulative weight of 1,000 small discoveries, each one pulling another thread from the loom of time. There's something irresistible about a secret hiding in plain sight, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Psychologists call this the curiosity gap, the mental itch that compels us to dig deeper when we sense there's more to a story. The Gothic weavers understood this instinctively. By threading their rebellion into tapestries meant to glorify the powerful, they turned every viewer into a potential conspirator. The moment someone leaned closer, squinting at a falcon's oddly frayed tether or a rose's suspiciously sharp thorns, they weren't just observing art, they were participating in its defiance. And that's the genius of coded resistance. The message sticks because the audience does half the work. This tactic thrives on a simple truth: our brains remember what we uncover far better than what we're told outright. Modern studies of activism show similar patterns. During the Cold War, dissidents in Eastern Europe circulated jokes laden with double meanings. Listeners who got it felt a thrill of connection, locking the subversion into memory. Today, street artists use layered stencils that reveal hidden images only from certain angles, turning pedestrians into detectives. Like the tapestry's weavers, these creators know that when someone pieces together a message themselves, it becomes personal. The rebellion isn't just heard, it's claimed. What makes symbolic resistance so enduring is its ability to forge silent alliances. A noblewoman admiring a tapestry might laugh at a hidden joke meant to mock her rival, oblivious that the same pattern is rallying rebels in the kitchen below. The art becomes a mirror, reflecting back what each viewer expects to see until the moment it doesn't. This duality creates a safety net. If authorities crack down, the plausible deniability is baked in. It's just decoration, the weavers could shrug, even as their needles stitched revolution. Contemporary movements have refined this approach. Protesters in Hong Kong used a yellow umbrella as their emblem, innocuous to outsiders but loaded with meaning for locals. Online, activists embed censored phrases in harmless memes, relying on shared context to decode them. The principle remains unchanged from the Gothic era. The most potent rebellions are those that invite the audience to lean in, to look closer, to become keepers of the secret. After all, a message shouted in the streets can be silenced, but a whisper woven into the fabric of everyday life, that lingers. The tapestry's creators grasped something deeper about human nature, that the act of uncovering truth is itself transformative. When a servant recognized the hidden stag in a hunting scene, they didn't just receive a message, they underwent a shift in perspective. Suddenly, the world held layers they'd never noticed. This psychological pivot from passive observer to active interpreter is what makes symbolic resistance so corrosive to oppressive systems. It doesn't just challenge authority, it teaches people to question the very way they see. And once that skill is learned, it can't be unlearned. The loom's true rebellion wasn't in the threads, it was in the eyes of those who learned to read them. The urge to resist oppression without raising a sword echoes across cultures and centuries, proving that the Gothic weavers were far from alone in their silent defiance. Consider the samurai of feudal Japan, warriors bound by honor codes that forbade open criticism of their lords. Instead of rebellion on the battlefield, they turned to ink-crafting haiku that praised cherry blossoms in one breath while skewering corruption in the next. A poem about a withering tree might lament a daimyo's greed, its true meaning clear only to those who knew the local lord had recently seized timberlands. Like the tapestry's hidden stitches, these verses wrapped critique in beauty, ensuring their survival long after blunt words would have been met with execution. Halfway across the world, enslaved Africans in the American South spun their own coded resistance through spiritual songs that seemed pious to plantation owners but carried maps to freedom. Wade in the Water wasn't just a hymn, it was a survival guide, its lyrics advising escapees to mask their scent from tracking dogs. The parallel to the Gothic weavers is uncanny. Both transformed the very crafts their oppressors demanded into vehicles for liberation. A quilt hung on a cabin wall might display an innocent star pattern by day, but by candlelight, its stitches revealed the constellations guiding travelers north. During the darkest days of Soviet rule, dissidents perfected the art of samizdat, forbidden literature typed in secret and passed hand to hand like contraband. A copy of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago might be disguised as a knitting manual, its true contents hidden beneath layers of mundane patterns. The risks were immense, but so was the payoff. By the 1980s, these underground texts had eroded state propaganda more effectively than any protest march. Like the tapestry's messages, samizdat thrived because it was too decentralized to crush. Every reader became a potential copier, scattering the rebellion faster than authorities could contain it. Even nature itself has been recruited into these quiet revolts. In 19th century Java, colonized farmers planted indigo, a cash crop demanded by Dutch overlords, in deliberate patterns that spelled out protest messages visible only from the hills above. The colonial administrators, focused on yield percentages, never thought to read the fields themselves. This agricultural subterfuge mirrors how Gothic nobles admired their tapestry's craftsmanship while missing the subversion woven into every thread. What unites these disparate movements isn't just their cleverness, but their understanding of power's blind spots. Tyrants expect resistance in shouts and swords. They rarely think to check the embroidery hoop, the folk song, or the rice paddy. The samurai's poem, the spiritual's coded verse, the samizdat's false cover, all prove that when expression is criminalized, creativity becomes the ultimate weapon. And like the tapestry's legacy, their impact often outlasts louder rebellions precisely because they work slowly, sinking deep into culture's bedrock until they're impossible to uproot. Perhaps the most striking modern parallel comes from digital activism. Today's protesters might use emoji strings to coordinate under authoritarian surveillance, or hide anti-censorship tools in innocuous gaming apps. The medium has changed, but the strategy remains timeless. Wrap your defiance in something the powerful consider harmless, then watch as their dismissal becomes your advantage. From medieval threads to encrypted tweets, the quiet rebellions endure not despite their subtlety, but because of it. The Gothic weavers' rebellion holds up a mirror to modern activism, revealing truths that transcend centuries. Their greatest weapon wasn't brute force, but patience, the understanding that change often unfolds at the pace of thread through fabric. Today's movements, from climate activism to digital rights advocacy, could learn much from this approach. Consider how the weavers embedded their critique in symbols so enduring they outlasted kingdoms. Modern equivalents might be the pink pussy hats of women's marches or the umbrellas of Hong Kong protests, ordinary objects transformed into potent, replicable emblems. The brilliance lies in their mundanity. Like the tapestry's decorative motifs, these symbols slip past censors because they don't look like threats until it's too late. Unity was another thread in the weavers' strategy. They operated not as lone provocateurs, but as a distributed network, guilds sharing techniques, noblewomen quietly commissioning subversive works, servants passing messages along laundry lines. This decentralized model finds echoes in today's leaderless movements, where hashtags replace looms as tools of coordination. The tapestry's lesson: resistance thrives when it's woven into daily life, when everyone from the apprentice to the duchess holds a strand. Modern organizers might take note. Lasting change often comes not from charismatic figureheads, but from countless hands pulling in the same direction, even if they never meet. Perhaps the most radical lesson is in the power of subtlety. The weavers knew their audience, knew that nobles would proudly display art that mocked them because vanity outweighs scrutiny. Contemporary activists employ similar psychological judo. A meme mocking authoritarian leaders spreads faster than a manifesto because it's shareable, because laughter disarms. Banksy's shredded artwork didn't just critique the art market, it weaponized the spectacle itself, much like the tapestry's grandeur protected its secrets. Both prove that sometimes the best way to challenge power is to hand it a megaphone, then whisper your truth into it. The tapestry's endurance offers another insight: culture outlasts politics. While edicts and tax laws faded, the woven rebellion seeped into songs, children's games, even religious devotion. Modern movements increasingly recognize this, using art installations and viral challenges to cement ideas in the public consciousness. A protest sign might be torn down, but a melody humming through crowds or a dance trend mocking corruption, those are harder to erase. The weavers understood that when you make your critique inseparable from beauty and tradition, it becomes immortal. Yet the most urgent lesson might be about adaptability. The original weavers' symbols morphed over time. The falcon in one town became a pickaxe in mining regions, then a fishing net along the coast. Today's activists face similar needs to localize their messaging. A climate protest in Berlin might feature polar bears, while in Mumbai it's monsoon patterns. The core truth remains, but the packaging shifts to resonate. Like the tapestry's motifs, the most effective modern symbols are specific enough to mean something, vague enough to mean anything. What ultimately connects 15th century weavers to 21st century protesters is their shared understanding of power's blind spots. Authorities track weapons and manifestos, but often overlook the subversion in a song's lyrics, a mural's brushstrokes, or a hashtag's double meaning. The tapestry's legacy reminds us that oppression is like a suit of armor, impressive from the front, but full of gaps if you know where to look. And sometimes the quietest threads weave the strongest nets. The story of this tapestry lingers not because it's a relic of the past, but because it's a mirror held up to every era where power meets resistance. Its threads whisper a timeless truth: oppression may dictate the rules, but creativity rewrites them. Think of the courage it took to weave dissent into something as scrutinized as a nobleman's wall, hanging every stitch a gamble, every color a calculated risk. That same audacity lives on in modern protests, where a meme can topple a reputation or a song becomes an anthem for change. The tapestry's genius was making rebellion beautiful enough to be admired by the very people it mocked, and that paradox still resonates today. Consider how its legacy unfolds in unexpected places. A graffiti artist in a repressive regime paints a mural that looks like abstract art until sunlight hits at noon, revealing a dissident's face. A programmer embeds anti-censorship code in a viral video game, hiding tools in plain sight. These aren't just echoes of the weaver's tactics. They're proof that the instinct to cloak truth in beauty is universal. The tools have changed: spray cans instead of silk threads, algorithms instead of dye lots, but the strategy remains startlingly familiar. What makes the Tapestry story so enduring isn't just its cleverness, but its humanity. Behind every hidden symbol were real hands calloused from the loom, trembling with fear or defiance. We'll never know most of their names, yet their work outlasted kingdoms. That's the power of art as resistance. It transcends individuals, becoming collective memory. When protesters today stitch their demands into banners or encode messages in knitting patterns, they're joining a lineage that stretches back to those Gothic workshops. The materials evolve, but the thread connecting them never breaks. And here's the twist: the tapestry's greatest rebellion might be how it challenges our own complacency. In an age of endless scrolling and fleeting outrage, its story asks, where are the hidden messages in our world? What truths are draped over corporate lobbies or woven into the apps we use daily? The weavers teach us to look closer, to question what's presented as mere decoration or entertainment, because oppression seldom announces itself with a shout. More often, it's the quiet hum of the status quo. So the next time you pass a mural, a billboard, even a viral TikTok trend, pause. Ask what lies beneath the surface. The tapestry's real gift wasn't just its coded critique. It was training generations to see the world as layered, as full of secrets waiting to be read. And that's where its power becomes ours, because once you've learned to spot the thorns hidden in the rose, you can't unsee them. You become part of the story, another set of hands holding the thread. Perhaps that's why this medieval masterpiece feels so urgently modern. In a time when truth is often tangled in noise, it reminds us that change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quietest voices, the ones stitched into the fabric of everyday life, that unravel empires. And if a single tapestry could spark a century of defiance, imagine what today's creators might weave, if only we dare to look closely enough to understand.